Hello, and welcome back to the podcast, Trial Lawyer Prep. I'm your host, Elizabeth Larrick, and I'm glad you're here. This is episode 99, and I'm celebrating already before 100 because it has been a journey, and I'm so glad that you have been here with me. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. This is a podcast dedicated to lawyers preparing cases better, getting ready for trial. We talk about preparing clients. We talk about preparing for trial, focus groups, and a few little tidbits along the way. I like to have guests join us. And next episode, which is 100, I'm going to do something not totally different, but I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to do the podcast going forward. And I'm going to change a few things up, test some things out, and you guys can let me know whether you like it or not. But my hope is that to give more context to what we're talking about. So today's episode, we're going to talk about deposition preparation specifically for clients who do not have English as their first language and using a translator in preparation. So this episode is for folks who have clients who don't have English as their first language. And in my experience, most of the folks that I have or have worked with are a Spanish to English translation, but this is not limited to that. I mean, I think what we're going to talk about as far as the problem and the translator helping with this goes to any translator, any kind of language that we are working with, mainly because there's so many different variations of Spanish. And best example I can give you is, of course, I know book Spanish, but when I go to speak with somebody who is a native speaker from Mexico, like we're kind of lost. Now, let me just right off the bat tell you, I don't speak it. I can understand what they're saying enough to know that we are lost in translation. So what I want to dig into today is how to take your preparation for these particular clients to a whole nother level and to really gear them up for using a translator in the deposition. So I always suggest to use a translator or hire a translator, somebody not in your office, to come in and help during deposition preparation. And particularly if you're going to, when you do the role play session, definitely get that translator in there to help in that session, because there's so much that has to be learned extra on our clients in this situation, because they're having to be very patient for our translator. They're having to be very patient listening and waiting for their turn. You know, if there's objections and understanding all those things, which is normal for a client, but then knowing they have to kind of wait for the translator. And most people, most clients that I have dealt with know enough English to know what's happening and going on. They're just much more comfortable. They want to testify in Spanish because that's what they understand very well. So I'm working with some folks right now, and we're using a translator during preparation, not just during the role play. And it has been such an eye-opening experience because of the vast difference between the translator's version of Spanish to English and then his version. And it's not that either one is wrong, but it has been such a education for me in the words that we may say in a question and how they get translated and then given over. And then there's this just huge block, and it's a car wreck case. And so we're talking about, you know, navigating the road and passing cars and getting around cars. And of course, there's 1,000 ways to say it in English, but there's only so many verbs in Spanish. And so that's why, like, we just kind of got lost in translation. So it's been so helpful for him to kind of understand, oh, like, this is the word that I use here is so important. And they were also, you know, kind of lost with this translation of easy versus better. And so he kept saying easy when he was intending to say better. And she was just translating it that way. Again, you know, nothing wrong with the way she was translating it, but that's just the way, you know, from the book Spanish, that's what it says. So I know that when we use translators in deposition prep, it gives them a whole nother layer of what to expect and how to teach themselves to be patient, to wait. But also what I tell them is like, this is helpful. because you are going to have a lot more space to understand no. You're going to have to work with the translator, somebody you have no idea with. But that also sometimes when we have this translation chain, a lot of the times translators don't translate tone. Some do. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you're sitting in a deposition and opposing counsel's asking your client question and the translator is actually translating the tone, which doesn't need to be done because we all understand tone. We don't really, as kids, we know what a bad tone is, a good tone is. So we don't really need the translator to do the tone. But, hopefully you get the impression, the tone of the question, and it's translated. And hopefully that gets a little bit minimized, right, by the time they get the question to them. But it's been so helpful to have a translator as somebody outside of your office because there's always a comfort level with speaking with somebody in your office or even speaking with you. If you speak in Spanish or another language with your clients, there is a whole other layer of preparation that you can give them by bringing in a stranger and having them go through that experience. And this is another reason why we always say bring in a different lawyer or bring in a new face to do that role play no matter what, because they need that experience of a complete stranger asking them questions, hammering them on the details and giving them, what happens in a deposition, a real life experience. And bringing in a translator significantly helps because they're going to realize, oh, wow, not only do I have to answer this question, but I've got this other person who's translating who may get it wrong. And I need to work really hard to make sure I understand that question the way that with the words they're using. And so that's my little tidbit for today. I've always suggested, I've done this myself in cases, and I've every time we've used a translator in preparation, I'm always glad that we do. And in this particular instance, the way I'm talking about it with you today is we hired a translator for more sessions. And it just has been so much more helpful to get that help and assistance and know, oh, here's this challenge with talking about what happened in the crash because of all these different verbs. And let's get, what is the truth? What is it that you want to say so that we make sure it's translated correctly in English? And the concern that I had, of course, because not having had somebody there for such an extended amount of time was, well, what is the ethical concern? Does this break confidentiality? And so we talked with a translator with quite a bit about it before we felt comfortable. And she said, no, that's an ethical code that we have, as an official, court certified interpreter, translator, it's confidential. We're not breaking confidentiality by translating, being here and translating. So if you had that concern pop up, like I did, she assured us, nope, that's, she would never be able to reveal anything. She's the translator. And that's kind of the code of ethics they have for a court certified interpreter. So be thinking of that. If you're going to go get someone and hire someone, you want to go basically get somebody who's from a certified or court list, not just maybe the other person who speaks Spanish down the hallway in your office, or somebody, I'm not going to say off the street, but somebody else that's in your home, or a friend or family that you really want to get somebody who's going to be stuck with this and I call it book Spanish because that's really what it is. And I'm using Spanish as the example, but there are same thing with people who speak Russian. There are so many different flavors of that. And when you kind of understand the flavor that your client is speaking or that your deponent will be speaking, it's going to benefit you tremendously to also learn what are some of those differences in that specific dialect. Because then you can ask questions in that way to make sure you're hitting those verbs that you want. You're hitting that translation that you want. So it's helpful always to do this in your clients with deposition prep, but always be keeping that in mind when you are going to go depose somebody, where they're from regionally and how that may change the questions when you're going through a translator. And again, English, we've got 1,000 ways to say one different phrase. So, keep that in mind when you're asking questions. And I'll just add one other little story that I had come up again with the translators. We're running a focus group, getting this case ready for trial. And we're running a clip from the deposition, and the client is a Spanish speaker, and there's a translator, and opposing counsel's asking these questions. And it's about speed. How fast were you going? And, he testifies he's going 65, which ultimately we know from black box data and reconstruction, like he could not have been going 65. But what was interesting was we played this clip and we did some other things. And then one of the participants said, that translator was using a different kind of Spanish than that speaker. That speaker, he's from somewhere in Central America, and that translator, he wasn't translating it 100% correct what that guy was saying. And it was like, oh, wait a second, because this whole, of course, speed thing is kind of a hang up in the case, if you couldn't tell already. And so it was like a light bulb went off, oh, wait a second, that is probably, there's probably something lost in translation. And that's kind of what she was trying to say was, I don't think that he actually was saying that. I think the way that question came off, we understood as English, but he got a different version of it. And then he came back with a little bit of dialect, and then it got translated with book Spanish. And so it was that so it's like, wow, I'm so glad that she mentioned that. Again, what a nice little gem from a focus group that really hadn't been thought of, because the case had come along and gone through a different set of lawyers. And then this is the trial set, right? The lawyers are going to try the case. So super important to always be keeping that in mind when it comes to translating and dialect and regional stuff. And if you've got a deposition in your file that has a translator, go back and look at that. Go back and figure out, maybe there are definitely some places where it just doesn't translate the same when you have got dialect versus kind of that book, kind of Spanish or whatever the second language is. All right. This is a short and sweet episode on purpose. So thank you all so much for listening. I hope that this was helpful. Just keep it in mind. It's a little bit of an added expense to bring someone in to translate during Depo prep, but I guarantee it will tremendously help the client and probably reduce a little bit of time and tension in the actual deposition, because they're going to have had that process and that patience that they're going to have to build in more so than English speakers. I know we always tell them, well, just wait so I can object. Well, my gosh, they have to sit there even longer waiting for that translation. So anyhow, keep this in mind, use it a little bit, but just think about using somebody else for that to help get that little edge on translating. All right. I hope this was helpful. I can't wait until next episode, which is 100. And I hope that you tune in or catch it later on your favorite podcast platform. If you enjoy this podcast, please rate and review it wherever you are listening. And until next time, thank you so much.